Hi there, workplace innovators. My name is Vanessa Shaw, and I'm the founder of Human Side of Tech. Today, we're going to have a conversation about running experiments at work. This was an experiment all of its own. A couple of other colleagues of mine from the Happy Mailing Network, Josh Briggs and Andy Clough, all three of us discovered that we're passionate about running experiments and exploring change in our organizations and teams. And we wanted to dive into it a little deeper. So we started talking about it on Twitter and public places and also on our Slack channel. And well, Dave jumped out of the woodwork and said, hey, I'm passionate about this as well, and I'd love to join the conversation. So we went ahead and set up a virtual sort of fireside chat, coffee talk together. So you'll hear in this conversation from Dave Gray, Andy Clough, Josh Briggs, myself, as well as a few other members of our community like Lenny and Lena, who also jumped in and shared some of their experience working with clients and their teams on how to run successful experiments and to continue fostering cultures where learning and experimentation is just part of the way things work. So I hope you enjoy.
So let's just go ahead and start introducing ourselves. So per the Eventbrite, you saw that we have 4 of us here, kind of mad scientists, experimenters, curious to looking at this topic with all of you. And so myself, I'll say a few words and then ask Dave, Andy, and Josh to also introduce themselves. So I'm a facilitator and trainer. I've been working in the topic areas of communication and culture and dabbled in kind of the expat world, living the last couple of years in Europe, recently returned to San Francisco and working within the Agile and Lean communities. And yeah, I love all topics around how to make teams happier and understand culture of how people collaborate and work together at their best. So that's me. I'm Human Side of Tech on Twitter, so feel free to say hello. And Dave, why don't you go ahead and say a few words about yourself?
Okay, my name is Dave Gray. I'm Dave Gray on Twitter. You can find me there. I have my background is in design, but for the last 20 some years, I've been doing a lot of work in large-scale organizational change projects. And funny enough, design has a lot to offer when you're trying to do large-scale organizational change. And well, hope we can get into that. And one of the questions I'm hoping to explore today or want to spend some time on is this idea of I'm not the boss, I'm not an authority figure, I'm not the one who has the big budget. What can I do to make change happen? I think it's a great question. I get it a lot, and it's something I hope we can have some time to talk about today.
Hi, I'm Andy Clough. I'm on the East Coast, Philadelphia, New York area. I'm an Agile coach, probably about a decade's worth of practice in one form and another. Also doing facilitation and mentoring. I work at a slightly smaller scale. The systems or the tribes that I operate in tend to be 100 to 200 people. So I don't have the enterprise hierarchy to deal with, but I have smaller team dynamics to play within.
Great. Okay, Josh, do you want to say a few words?
Yeah, hi, I'm Josh. I'm in the Silicon Valley area near Vanessa. I'm also, like Andy, working with the small team dynamics. My background was about a decade-long career in the military, transitioned out from that, moving into the Agile space, and really just enjoying it, enjoying learning, and trying experiments. So been at some larger enterprise-level organizations, but found my happiness here at the smaller side. So.
Great. Wonderful. So let's get started with one of the themes in the questions that I saw. And it was really around how do we design experiments? What are key elements? How big should they be? How frequent should they be? How many people should be involved? What topic area do we start with? So I think this is a good place to begin. Some of us maybe have run an experiment or two and had that question of, did I include too many people? Did I not include enough? Did I make it run too long, too short? Was the structure of the experiment too kind of open and experimental? Should I have a little bit of structure? So I'd love to open the question up for Andy, Josh, or Dave to jump in with some ideas. I have a few of my own. So who'd like to go first?
Let's start with yours, Vanessa.
Yeah, okay, thank you. So through my own experimenting and work with kind of personal leadership and developing better habits, one of the concepts is to start small, call it micro experiments or micro practices. And I'm just going to mute our recent person who jumped in. Oh. Okay, sorry about that. All right. Yeah, so to keep things not too large and always to start with ourselves. So we can't ask other people to go on a transformational journey if I myself am not on one. And so starting with myself and looking introspectively of what's something that would improve my experience in the workplace or on the team, and how can I modify my behavior and experiment with a different approach first. So my 4 is start small, so keep it snack-sized or bite-sized. Start with myself. The other piece would be to make it visible. So if I'm starting with myself, then there's nobody else included at first, so I better make it visible so other people know that something's happening. So it could be anything from putting up a Kanban board and putting the experiment up there, putting some material that I'm using on my desk in a visible way, writing a blog post, sharing stories, can be various different ways. And then the other piece is to, of course, do the reflection element. So those are kind of some of my tips as far as getting started. But as far as some of the more large-scale enterprise or larger team approach to experiments, I maybe would hand that over to one of you to talk about your tips on that piece.
Well, I've mentioned Alyssa Briggs. I think it's Alyssa Briggs before, and she told me about some work that she did at Intuit, and while she was at that company, they have been doing a lot of experiments. They've been doing a lot of things to try and create innovation in the company, and they spent a lot of money, and they had a lot of things that didn't work. And the one thing that she came up with that did work that I thought was pretty amazing was this very simple thing. They basically had people within the company. Every team had someone who was alleviated of some portion of their duties and they would be called the experiment coach for the team. And what their only job was to make sure that the team was always running an experiment at any given time. And they trained a bunch of people in doing basically ongoing experiments and having one experiment going at any given time. And what happened was she told a bunch of stories, and I know she's coming on this organization a little bit later, maybe not today, but in a future session. And so you'll have a chance to meet her. But she told me, I just thought it was an incredibly smart thing. Instead of trying to figure out and trying to do innovation in some kind of black box way, to just empower each team to do experiments and make that part of the job and part of the expectation that you're going to always have an ongoing, experiment, and actually to give someone some free time to make that part of their job. So I think that's actually an enterprise scale. That's one of the best stories that I've heard of really trying to make innovation happen at scale. And it's simply by doing an experiment, it almost doesn't even matter what you're experimenting with. If you make it a habit to be experimenting and trying new things, you can't help but innovate and find new approaches and ideas.
Let me jump in and share my experience on the smaller scale. So with team total, company size at 100 or 150, what I have found really useful is to have people that are involved in various functional areas that have a toolbox of experiments that they can offer to their teams. And so with 125, for reference, there's 3 of us at various levels of expertise and experience. But the 3 of us meet on a regular basis to talk about experiment designs, tools, games, and things like that. And then we offer that up. So we have an open canvas or an open toolbox where team leads can come and self-select and have a built-in facilitator. The organizations that I'm working with have been relatively new to Agile and relatively new to their life cycle. So having this baked in set of things to play with has been pretty useful. And the experiments themselves are not very prescriptive. They're ideas that they can then adapt to their particular team situation. It's been helpful to tackle things that way.
Okay, and Josh, did you have any other comments on this kind of design elements of how to structure kind of a first experiment? How many people? How long?
Yeah, well, actually, Andy has been providing some good feedback on it for me as far as providing structure. I've just been kind of taking the approach of poke the system and see what happens. And sometimes that's yielded some great results, not knowing exactly what I'll find. So an example of that is creating a mobile happiness door, just something I've created on foam board, and posting that up in a team area so that it can populate with feedback for me, feedback for the retro, and they really just taken it as their own. And, you know, that just, it provides like, okay, here's something we need to have a mini postmortem about right now as a team, and things like that. Those are some more of just the kind of loose ones. And then also to the other side, I would actually love to hear Lenny talk about micro experiments, because I know that when we were all together at the conference, Lenny was just a wealth of knowledge in this area.
There we go. I'm unmuting. So, you know, micro is the interesting word there. And I have a bunch of things that ways that I communicate of what I mean by that particular topic, yet I often fall short in my description. People don't seem to get it. You know, to me, micro is stand on one leg while you're brushing your teeth, right? How does that impact you? And people, you know, how do I make that connection to the Agile work that I'm doing? So I always struggle in how to get people to conceive of doing those really, really small things that failure doesn't matter, right? It's a learning experience, and that's what I'm trying to get them to make the jump at. We do things here, you know, as far as tracking them. I use the experiment board or the celebration grid out of Jürgen's work, and we actually get people to post those things up there. Here's what I tried. I changed my screensaver so that it would remind me of different environments that we're working on, or I changed it to a word of the day type thing, and it gets people thinking differently. People having virtual coat racks in their cubes that say, I'm going to try on different hats when I write this code that allow me to think about different user experiences. So those are the type of micro experiments that I try to get people to run. Josh, I don't know if that's answering the question in the way that you intended it or not.
Yeah, absolutely. I think we're getting in that right direction of just doing whatever we can to get our teams and ourselves to think differently, become more self-aware as individuals, but also as a collective.
Yeah, I'll step in there. And I think one of the things that I think you're both talking about that I think is fascinating is this idea of we are, in most organizations, most of the time, we're walking around on autopilot. We're just kind of going through our routines and doing the things that we typically do. If you think about, you know, if you have a typical way that you go to work every day, whether it's to the bus or you drive a certain way, you have certain routines. And one of the simplest and easiest and most powerful experiments that you can do is simply turn off your autopilot. Simply force yourself to not do things the way that you typically have done them in the past. Just don't go to work the way that you have. And simply by, you know, putting a block in front of yourself and saying, you know, it doesn't matter what I do, I just can't do it the way I usually do it. You will find that you will suddenly become, first of all, you're going to become more mindful and conscious of what you're doing, because you can't, if you're not on autopilot, you have to pay attention. And secondly, you'll find other people starting to pay attention because you're not doing what they had predicted that you would do. And simply by disrupting your own routines, you can actually create some really powerful results. And all that you're doing is allowing yourself, you're basically forcing yourself out of your comfort zone. I think that's one of the most powerful and simple experiments you can do.
I agree. And when it's yourself that's involved, you assume all the discomfort and the ability to move ahead. One of the common themes that bubbled up in the questions, how do we deal with that discomfort at an organizational level? Whether it is managers above you, people around you that are happy continuing on in the status quo.
Dave and Andy, and that's where I struggle with the micro aspect, because a lot of times when we talk about those changes, Dave, changing the way that you drive to work is an excellent example of, that's a small experiment that you can do. But what a lot of the organizations here is, we want to change everything. We want to do the Samsung approach where change everything except for your wife and kids. And that's where we build in that fear factor. It's getting those experiments down to a manageable size where if it doesn't work out, or if it is slightly disruptive, it's not going to have a cataclysmic event. And that's where, to me, I think the organizational miss is that we're not explaining it well enough to understand that, hey, it's just a small tweak. It's not a major shift.
I think what you're talking about that resonates with me, Lenny, is that you're trying to make it safe. You're trying to create a space that allows people to start just playing a little bit. And what you're calling micro experiments, I sort of sometimes refer to as just creating safe space. If people are living in fear, or if they have a sense that they are not free to experiment. I mean, I think most of us have been, especially in large organizations, we've been trained for most of our work lives that, no, you toe the line, you follow the script, you do it the way you've been told to do it, and you do not deviate from that, or you get in trouble. You get knocked down for doing things that stand out. And now suddenly the managers of a lot of organizations are walking around saying, no, we want you to be creative now. We need more creativity in the organization. And everyone's kind of been trained to do things a certain way. And everyone's kind of looking at each other and looking at the boss and saying, yeah, you say that, but as soon as I step out, I'm going to get my head cut off probably. So I think what you're talking about, Lenny, and what I think is really powerful is this idea of you have to somehow find a way to create a space that's emotionally safe for people to step out and take risks and do things that are outside of their comfort zone. I was just on the Skype call this morning with a friend of mine at a large organization I will not mention, but what he's doing with his team is he's basically saying, let's just claim our space. What we want to do is we want to make our space comfortable. We're bringing in plants. We're doing things around our part of this organization where we're going to kind of own our space, and we're going to make it feel like a good place to be, like a place that has a good vibe, whether it's like a coffee shop or whatever. We're going to really make this space feel special and unique and safe. And they're actually working together on little things to figure out how to make that space really feel comfortable. So not only is it for them to feel comfortable, but for them to invite others into that space and start to create a little almost like a little safety bubble inside the organization where people can feel free to have those conversations and start that taking small risks.
That's a great way to summarize that, Dave. I totally agree with you. It is about that safety feeling.
And one of the other pieces that I think we're kind of dancing around, that we're saying, well, kind of getting out of the status quo or autopilot. And there's actually a new Twitter commercial from the clothing store Marshalls. And it's all about, what if I took a different road to work? What if I wore a different kind of outfit? What if I did this? And it's all around this question of exploring, well, what if? And I hear us saying, let's create the safe space. And I also kind of question, but we've gotten so used to doing what we're supposed to do, or what we're programmed to do. But if we look at what we did when we were kids, life was all about, what if I could fly? What if I could make these blocks into a building? What if? We're always thinking this way. And so when we get back into this creative space of, well, what if? It starts to get really comfortable, and it's a really fun place to be in. And so I think that's, a lot of what we're trying to do is creating this creativity to also, or opportunity for creativity that inspires engagement, which all the HR professionals will love to hear, and inspires innovation, which all of the product guys will love to hear. So one of the other themes that I saw in the question was the risk-averse phrase. So what do we do when we're in an environment of cultures where risk is priority, avoiding risk is the priority? What's something a person can do in that environment to impact this shift?
So I'm have some thoughts on that. The one thing about experiments and the idea of experimentation is that you can do experiments simply in your own mind. You don't have to make them public. You don't have to express them. Nobody even has to know that you're doing them. And a lot of times your own thoughts and biases and things impact your work environment in ways that you cannot even predict. And I think one of the most important things to understand about experiments is you do not have to believe that something is true in order to test it. And there's a really good reasons why you should test things that you don't believe are true, that you might actually be very skeptical about. And the reason for that is that usually there are only two ways that people make sense of new ideas. And one of them is, does it make sense given my experience? Given all the stuff that I know, does it seem like it makes sense? And then the second thing is, well, if I test it, if I try it, does it work? And the problem with that approach is that very rarely do we ever test any ideas that don't make sense. So if we hear an idea and it makes sense, then we test it and it works, and it's like, okay, well, we didn't really learn anything, did we? Because we only learned something that we already kind of made sense and we tried it. But when you start testing things that don't make sense is when you truly have an opportunity to learn really interesting stuff. So for example, I'm going to use a bad word here. Is that okay, Vanessa? All right. Let's say you think your boss is an asshole. Right? Let's just say you have a theory in your head. My boss is a jerk. Here's this little experiment you can do. It's very low risk for you, right? Just imagine, try an experiment that says, well, what if my boss was not a jerk? What if actually my boss was actually a really smart and a good person and a really smart person? How would I act differently? Or my coworker, whatever. How would I act differently if I actually thought they were an awesome person and a really good boss, a good person? How would I act differently? And then you don't even have to believe it. Just act as if it were true. Act in such a way, act how you would act if that were true, and see what happens. Because one of the things that's really powerful and exciting about these kind of, now, that's not an experiment that's going to be risky at all, right? Treating your boss like a good person, that's not a big risk in most organizations, right? Or your peer or your coworker or someone you think is maybe you think they're an enemy, they're out to get you. Ask them out for a coffee, have a conversation, act like they're your best friend. What you'll often find is that, number one, it's very disarming when you start acting differently around a person who's used to a certain routine and pattern of behavior. And suddenly you can find amazing things opening up, amazing opportunities, amazing changes opening up, simply by you taking on a new belief, something that you might even be a little bit skeptical about, and just start walking around acting as if it were true and see what happens. And especially when it comes to beliefs about other people, because what happens is, when we have beliefs about other people that we work with, we are acting in ways that reinforce our existing beliefs all the time. If I think you're a problem person, Vanessa, and I know you're just out to get me, I'm gonna treat you and act towards you in ways that are going to reinforce that. And in many cases, I'm going to make that true by the way I behave, not by the way you behave. I'm going to create that reality by the way I interact with you. And if you want to actually try and experiment and find some different opportunities and different realities, one of the sneakiest and most interesting and best ways to do it, I think, is by changing your own attitudes and behaviors. And you don't have to actually believe it, but you just have to pretend. Pretend another reality exists and see what happens. And I've seen some really amazing things happen when people do that.
I can't help but notice that you are also carrying on with this idea of, well, what if they were actually a nice person? And there's this great activity so if I'm trying to pretend that, actually envisioning that I'm putting on rose-colored glasses when I look at this person. And I just see the positive things. Or another great thing is when to envision that between my thoughts and their existence, there's like fluffy pillows and unicorns and flowers that my thoughts have to travel through in order to get to them. It's a sort of an envisioning practice to help them shift a little bit about how I interact with the person. If I'm thinking through rose-colored glasses and fluffy pillows, that my thoughts kind of soften, become a little bit more approachable. So just kind of looping back to this concept or this topic area of, risk averse. So things, my boss isn't interested, my colleagues are not interested, I'm all on my own, nobody wants to risk running an experiment. What can I do? Andy or Josh, do you want to share? Have you any experience with something kind of scenario like this?
So I'll borrow Dave's question. When you have those thoughts, stop and ask yourself, is that true? Or is that your perception? And then react accordingly. If somebody says, no, you can't do that, I guess you have two choices, right? Get permission to do it, or do it without and ask forgiveness later. We're talking about small experiments, not grand ones. I think either one's possible. I was part of a discussion not too long ago where people were talking about risk. And I think one of the questions that bubbled up was, how do we convince a waterfall organization that has traditional line managers, that experiments are really worth the risk? And I chuckled because with a large waterfall approach, you don't really change the risk, you just postpone it. It's at the very end when you ship. And which manager would rather have that big ball of risk at the very end as opposed to small pieces along the way and be able to react and change the course? So when I'm confronted with, no, we can't do that, it's too risky, I try to break it down and say, is that true? What's the real risk here? Let's make a small piece and test it. The other piece that I have to deal with is, do we accept failure? I mean, if we're able to accept failure that's small and we learn from it, and that's part of the celebration grid. I have to look at Alyssa Briggs's piece where failure fits in. But if we accept that failure is a viable option and we learn from it, further, we minimize that big ball of unknown risk that these larger legacy systems say, no, we can't do that, it's too risky. So I think, in short, is it really risky? And if we can break it into small pieces and learn from it, why not go for it?
Andy, I've got a question or observation about that. One of the things, I wrote a post very briefly about this a couple of weeks ago, that one of the ways to help get people more comfortable with that level of risk is if we actually have data that supports, right? We do these experiments and then we move on, and then we do the next experiment and then we move on, right? We never go back and look at the actual data of what came out of that experiment, and how do I get intimate enough with that data that I can calculate the amount of risk for the next experiment. Right? Based on the experiment that I've done before, here's what my results were. Now I look at the outliers and, wow, this happened, what was the causal relationship between these things? This gives me now fodder for building up my next experiment that I can mitigate that risk or show, my client or my organization, hey, when we do this types of things, these are the risks that we're exposing ourselves for. Can we get comfortable with that?
I just want to add to that, because when we're talking about the risk, we have like each end of the spectrum. We have like the crazy risk takers, right, who's ready to just jump off the cliff, and that's where we're learning. And then we have people who need a large amount of certainty on the other end. And often we can learn a lot from having team members who have that bigger need for certainty, because it's going to put us in check as well if we're all the way out here on the risk takers ready to jump off the cliff. Because if I agree with you, Lenny, if we also need to go back and learn from that. Hey, let's pull in the data. Like, let's not reinvent the wheel every time. Like, these people who kind of maybe are devil advocates in our team they can kind of irritate us because they slow things down, but we need them to hold our own risk willingness a little bit in check. And I think in many ways, the wording around risk can really just even put people who need more of that certainty, push them off. We can also start playing around with our language in our teams to make it come across so it doesn't put them off, right? Like, and just know that's because they need more certainty to move forward, and that can be a good process. We don't want to be spending too much time in that. Like, it's a balance, right? Like, we can't be like taking so long to make all the assessments that we never dare do any of these micro experience. But I just kind of wanted to add that in there.
Are there some specific phrases that you have found are useful to avoid, and other ones that you have found particularly powerful when you talk outside of the Agile coaching lexicon? I'm curious.
I think some of us who are risk takers, I think some of our characteristics is like, oh, we don't want to wait, right? Oh, I'm sitting on my hands, I can't move forward. So I think some of our vocabulary would be like, oh, let's just try it out. I mean, that would be the first red light for someone who needs more certainty, right? So kind of it's almost like we need to put a little bit of our damper on some of our enthusiasm to just like go be messy with it. And I think that's where we can do those. Well, that can be micro experiments that we're doing maybe for ourselves, but when we're asking our teams, we can kind of rephrase things a little bit different. It's like, could we try that out? In my experience, this is some of the learnings I've had from that. And I think the celebration grid kind of helps people in our team who needs that transparency on what we're doing. I think it's like guiding them. When people who are very risk takers, we don't need that guidance. We're just ready to go with the flow, and that's exciting.
I actually think you're creating safe space, aren't you, for people when you do that? When you're running experiments that other people are feeling are like moving too fast for where they're comfortable with, by backing off the accelerator a little bit, you're making that space a little safer for them to try things. And in some ways, you're making it safe by showing that you can do things. But if you're the only one always doing things, then it's easy for people to go, well, yeah, she can get away with it, but I don't think I could. And by backing off a little bit and making space for other people to play with you there, I think it's creating more safety. You're creating a little bit of a comfortable space for them to do that.
And on that note, I would actually say that I think it's important that, and that's some of the things that I also know that Josh is playing around with, that the notion around experiments becomes something that's our team, and as a culture and identity that we have as a team. So it doesn't become, well, she's always the one who's ready to do that, and then that becomes an identity for a certain team member. That it becomes, well, as a team, are we committed that we want to explore this? As a team, we want to explore our boundaries because we agree that we can learn from this. So you build that vocabulary and that identity within a team. And that may be what I haven't dug into Melissa Briggs, but that seems like that's kind of more what she's working on as well, right? Like to create that identity within the team, making it feel safe, but also being like, we're all on board on this.
Yeah, I think part of what Alyssa does, and I know she's going to be coming back and talking in a later episode, but part of what she does is she has something she calls the experiment grid, and I'll put a link to that in the chat here so people can see it. But she's created a template that also makes it somewhat easy for people to think through an experiment, and it has space for, the thing here. I'll put it in the chat right now. It has space for, what's the idea? What are the assumptions? What is our hypothesis? What is the experiment we're going to do, and how are we going to know that it's working? I just put it in the chat for everybody. I think that's really useful in terms of giving people, sometimes people need a little structure to make them feel safe. They need a little bit of, give me some kind of box to play in that makes me feel like I can understand this. And by having teams have a coach, that's part of it. People are given some comfort because someone in authority said, well, yeah, it's part of your job is to make sure there's experiments that are running. So it's endorsed, it's okay. And you are the coach for the team. You're not the one whose job it is to do the experiments. It's just your job to make sure that the team has always got something going on. And here's a template, and we'll give you some training and help you give you a sense of practice. And that gives, just like anything. I mean, if you can remember back to when you first learned how to ride a bike, you don't want someone to just throw you on a bike and push you down a hill. You want a little bit of time to get comfortable with it first, right?
Yeah, if I could jump in here real quick too. Definitely, I would say vulnerability needs to be happening on our part. We need to be as vulnerable, or actually more vulnerable than what we're expecting from those we're hoping that will go in on us with our experiments. And that is something I've learned a little bit the hard way. When I was in the military, there was no real need to try to be vulnerable or even transparent. It was just, hey, this is something I'd like to do, and then we'd all do it. There was a kind of a spirit of competition. Transitioning and working with knowledge workers has been very beneficial for me on that, because I have had to slow down. I've had to see where it's been good, because it reveals where there's a lack of safety, or at least a perception on that individual's part. One of that came recently with a product owner. I was just trying to sit down and play the movie Motivators. For those of you who are familiar with them, for those who aren't, it's just laying out intrinsic motivators and identifying what motivation is on each one of those categories. And the first thing was, they told me is, I don't want to play this. I feel like this is a psychological experiment. I don't know what judgments you're going to make about me. And what I learned from there is, like, I need to start that whole conversation initiation by playing it myself, showing them that, being very open and transparent from there. But then it revealed a whole lot of other things, like, okay, this person hides a lot. Whenever they are wanting to make a business decision or direction for the team to work on, they'll hide behind a stakeholder, saying, this stakeholder is telling us to do that, even though that actually isn't the case. The stakeholder said, oh, have you guys looked at this? This might be a nifty idea. So that's where failing at running experiments successfully with the buy-in has in some ways been beneficial for me. But definitely learning to be vulnerable with them, and identifying just working slowly to identify where are those emotional strongholds.
So a theme that I'm hearing in our discussion was also a question that came up around, getting experiments in a sort of hackathon or a innovation tournament. And so just to give you a little bit of background, Andy and Josh and I connected about a month or almost 2 months ago. With Josh had an idea, why don't we run a kind of March Madness, maybe Mad Scientist Experimenters Challenge Month. And then we said, this is interesting. We've been looking at it, kind of playing around with different ways to kick that off into something that could scale into other organizations. We're still experimenting with it. And actually this call today is a product of our experimenting. We said, well, hey, why don't we get together some others to talk about what is going on this topic? So Josh, you could maybe elaborate on this concept of a tournament of sorts. Maybe Dave or Andy, you've run into these kind of ideas in your work. So let's look at what that could look like to get people.
Josh, someone in the chat was asking about the game. Maybe you could share a little bit more about the Motivator game?
Yeah, absolutely. Moving Motivators is a game that you can find on the Management 3.0 website and Happy Melly. It's taking 10 intrinsic motivators: curiosity, mastery, honor, acceptance, and so on. And then it's just allowing the person to organize it in a baseline. And what I've also run into is that you'll hear team members say, well, I feel like these three are similar and I can't organize one of them. And right there, that's just a good moment to recognize that and pause the exercise and be like, well, why? Yeah, if you all can see, Lena's holding up a set of the Moving Motivator cards.
Cool.
And so you just lay it out in a baseline. And then from there, you can talk about, well, what's affecting curiosity? What's positive about it? What's negative? Those kinds of things. And it's a great exercise, at least for me, as far as self-awareness goes and understanding how I am doing. Working with that to move actually towards developing it for the team to have a baseline. So we can do a quick check-in and ask, how's motivation doing here? What kind of things are we working on? So are we giving enough variation in work? Are we, actually stepping on each other's toes, things like that. So different things that you could do with moving motivators. If there's more questions, I believe somebody linked, you'll find a description and some videos from the Management 3.0 website on it. But switching over to the competition, I am not a sports watcher. I like playing sports, but around my office, everybody's like, hey, you're going to do March Madness competition pool. For those of you who aren't familiar with basketball or the March Madness tournament, it is essentially a elimination bracket system. So you'll have about, 16 teams to go in, and then from that it dwindles down until the top two head off together. And, people are around here filling out their brackets and betting on it, that kind of good old stuff. So for me, I like challenges. I like competition. Not to say that I'm better than somebody, but it inspires me. Can I do what they did at that level or even better? Can I do something equally as innovative or just crazier? And so that's where I got that concept of trying to create a March Madness of mad scientists or mad experimenters. And from there, it's evolving, though, of how do we bring about collaboration? How do we attract others into this? How do we make it safe for competition and not just shutting others down? How do we improve upon each other's experiments? And so those are some of the questions that Andy and Vanessa and myself have attempted to answer. And then one of the things from that is looking at the celebration grid as even creating a point bracket or a pointing system from that. And then from there, we've even evolved that into looking at, we'll come up with the values yourself. Maybe it's not numerical. Similar to story points, some teams use small domesticated animals instead of just story points. And so for my own celebration grid, for example, if you're familiar with the celebration grid, down at the bottom quadrant, an actual failure where you attempted to do something that you had no idea what you were really doing and it didn't work out. So there's zero learning because you started with no knowledge and you gained no knowledge. For the point value for that for me is a cucumber, because I personally hate the taste and fragrance of cucumbers. But then as far as like a big win where you attempted an experiment, you learned a lot, that kind of thing, the point value would be a nice cigar and a glass of scotch. And so that kind of thing, that where you could actually propose that to a team, and it just creates another bonding activity of like, well, how do we even come up with point values that reflect us as a group?
I think
anything else you like to mention?
I was just thought it'd be maybe it's a good point for those people who are here who are not familiar with Jürgen Appelo and Management 3.0, because we've mentioned it a few times now. Just to talk about him a little bit, I mean, he's a fascinating guy. I've spoken to him a couple of times, and he's one of the founders of Happy Melly, right? And he, I think, one of the things that I remember in talking to him that came through loud and clear was he just decided at one point, if I'm going to do this job, he was a manager, a technical manager, I believe, CTO or something like that. he said, I'm going to do this job. I'm going to make sure I have fun, and I'm going to make sure that people around me have fun. And people are so much more productive when they're having fun. And I think the stuff that you're talking about, the motivation, moving motivators, and the celebration grid, I think they're all part of a much larger, and I think that's kind of the philosophy of Happy Melly, isn't it? Right? It's sort of like the larger perspective here is that we can all be much more productive and we can actually get much more work done and get a lot more done if we just remember how much better work is when we're having fun. We're having fun together. How much better teams operate. How much more work gets done. How much more things happen when people are just enjoying themselves.
And I think a lot of that comes with playtime. Somebody talked about kids earlier, how free and easy they are. And then we also talked at the other side of that is how large, even medium enterprises put in policies and frameworks. We do it this way. And so experimentation for me is an adult method of play. A chance to, in a paying situation, play with a system of people and experiment. And so it's really delightful. One of the topics, so I love this, the story that Josh related, how we got from March Madness to a celebrations grid with whiskey, single malt. I hope it's single malt scotch and Cuban cigars. And that was just an ad hoc game that we played one afternoon to get from, okay, how do we make March Madness work? And we ended up with something different. And so I try to do the same things within the sandboxes I play with. Hackathons was one of the things that came up as, is that an experiment? Absolutely is. And it's situational. There's as many ways to set up innovation days as there are companies, and even within a company with the teams. So I'll share with you something we did this past quarter. With our relatively young organization, we developed functional silos, centers of excellence around either a particular language or a particular skill set like UX or iOS coding. And for all of us that are agilists or Scrum people, that doesn't really mix very well with the classic cross-functional team that has everything it needs to execute. So our experiment was Hackathon Day, 2 days. Anybody from anywhere in the company can participate, and that was the guardrail. Well, there was, you present at the end of the day something. And so people got together and through our async board put up ideas, and maybe we had a dozen ideas, and then people self-selected. Well, I could work on that. That would be my first choice, my second choice, my third choice. If I do that, this is my skill set. If I do that, that's my skill set. And out of that bubbled up 3 teams that, lo and behold, were cross-functional, and they produced stuff, and they said, wow, this was awesome. What was really great was all of us here, we had everything we needed to reach our vision. Can we do more of that? And I was like, hallelujah. Now the next trick is how to scale that, right? How to begin over time to say, well, we've always handed it from design to client, who then talked to the back end. And 6 months later, we, brought it back to client. How do we shorten that cycle? And that innovation day, that hackathon, was an experiment that pulled back the lid to people to say, this is one way we could do it.
So that's a great example, Andy. And I want to add to that, like the notion some organizations have what they call like guilds, where it's like, okay, well, we have our function, or we have the projects we're working on, but let's make sure we also have these other interests, and they should just totally get created with what people are interested in, right? Like they want to solve this, or they want to explore this. They can be nerds who want to dive into a certain theory, or someone who want to explore it with a certain technique, or, that you have these that's just really being developed or grow kind of organically out of a a passion that people have, so that they can bring their passion, like, we have passion for our hobbies, like we'll do the craziest thing and spend a long time on it in our free time because it's our passion. That if we can bring that passion to our work, and that would just be creating those cross-cultural, cross-functional teams. And that's with that notion around GILs, right? And because then you also have that motivational factor in our teams, and we will be learning and being innovative just by default, because we're going to break down silos.
There was a related question to that topic, and I'm curious how you've solved this. It was around when we have, a demanding schedule and we have no capacity and the teams are fully committed. How do you make time for experiments? How do you make time for that competency? How do you make time for that play?
I think that could just be with asking random questions at your daily scrum or whatever type of check-in meeting you have with your teams. And that could reveal even to the point of how able to play mentally are our team members. I've been in a situation where we just asked a simple question of, you go anywhere in the world, where would you go? And some people who were so overburdened by work could not mentally engage with that question. Their response was, there's no way I'm going to get vacation approved right now. And so you just see immediately right there that that's a good place to start, because their level of play is negative,
Yeah, it's a really great question. I think the bottom line is that if there's no, it's just like running a machine nonstop without taking any downtime and without having any time for maintenance. So I think it's easy to get into this sort of kind of dysfunctional place where you really, I remember in my company, we were in a high growth period and we were actually hiring new people, but the experienced people were so busy that they were not even able to make time to train the new people. So we had these escalating and increasing work, the experienced people taking on more and more because it was just easier in the short term to do it than to train somebody else how to do it. And what we did, and this is not something that, this took some effort, but we did as a team. We actually said, look, we're going to take 2 hours a week. We're just going to carve it out and we're just going to force it out. And we made it between like 4 to 6 p.m. on a Thursday. So it was sort of like half the office time and half personal time. And we had made sure we had beer and pizza, and we did practice. We role played and we practiced work, and we kind of turned it into kind of a fun thing. But it was very hard to do it. It's actually like, because people were feeling, to Josh's point, so stressed out. But once we got in the habit of doing it once a week, we called it Visual Thinking School. It's still actually going on. It's now down to once a month. But once you build that habit in of just taking an hour or a couple hours a week just to practice and play, and make sure you carve that out and make sure you schedule around it, just like anything else. If you're going to work out every day, you need to build it into your schedule and make it a habit. That's something that's sometimes hard to get the team to agree to, but I think most people will, at some level, will recognize, look, if we just continue to burn out, then we're not ever going to be getting any traction here. Let's just carve out, even if it's just a half hour, let's just carve out some time so we can actually get these new people on board. We can train people. We can make it fun. It's always helpful if you can have food and drinks there. People have to eat anyway. So you make a little time for that. You make a little space for that, and you make it fun. I think with a little effort, you can build in a little bit of time for people to actually, reflect on their work.
Yeah. And Dave, I think kind of is good timing. We've just got a couple minutes to wrap up here. And I was thinking, well, you've set aside, we've all set aside today an hour to explore experimenting. And there's more questions. There's some great comments from Elise and Francis and Ryan in the chat. I'll be saving those to include. But I just wanted to do a quick little mini micro experiment to put forward, what I believe, and many of us, I'm sure, agree that, the learning is the metric that we want to pay attention to. So Did we learn something? We ran an experiment with this call. So if you're on video with a show of kind of, I didn't learn anything, I kind of learned some things, or I learned a few things that I'm happy about, a show of thumbs. And if you're on the chat, a kind of a -1, a 0, or a +1. So what do we have here? Good, yeah, I see some other collaboration super cards. Hi, Lisette. Great, so I learned a lot too. And I know a lot of us are active and doing cool things. And feel free to add into the chat if you have a resource or an event or something we should know about. And one thing that I'd like to all of us kind of work on compiling and kind of have be the last comments here is 1 or 2 things in the experimenter's toolkit. And so for me, I would just reiterate to start small and to start with myself. Dave, do you have 1 to 2, 3 things?
Yeah, I have one experiment anyone can do. I got it from a friend of mine. This is an experiment anyone can do. Most workplaces, and it's pretty simple and it's incredibly powerful. What my friend did is he just got an electric tea kettle, like a teapot, and he brought it into his cubicle at work, and he kept it in his cubicle, and he kept all different kinds of tea and all different kinds of teacups in his workspace. And he would invite people to have tea with them. And if they were angry or whatever, however they felt, he would just say, hey, let's just have a cup of tea. He would turn on his tea kettle. He would make a cup of tea for them. He said that he discovered, number one, it takes a little bit of time to make tea. So even if someone's hopping mad, it's going to take him a minute because he's got to, turn on a tea kettle and make the thing. And he also said he discovered that it's impossible to be angry with a warm cup of tea in your hand. And this is a very simple thing that you can do in almost any work environment. And it can have some very dramatic effects on your work relationships. And just think about how simple that is. Have some tea bags and a teacup and a tea kettle, and have it handy, and a chair where you can sit and talk to someone. It's a very simple experiment, but I think it's a very powerful one.
I love it. I really love that. I'm going to go out and buy a teapot. For me, the most powerful thing that I've learned recently is make it an invitation, not an obligation. Make it an offer, and accept no as an answer.
Josh, any last words?
Yeah, just stay encouraged and keep trying. Get plugged into, I would recommend getting plugged into a community. The Happy Melody Slack channel has just been a wealth of encouragement and learning for me. And I think we all need that type of support as we go and try to make change, especially in responsible organizations.
And so just final plugs. Dave Gray has a book coming out in June, Liminal Thinking. Excited to hear that. As mentioned, we're going to loop back with Alyssa Briggs in possibly June or July for a similar conversation. Stay connected for that. Lenny, he's our colleague in Denver. You can experiment with him live in a 3-day course in June. We'll include a link for that. Andy and Josh and I are going to continue playing with experiments and see what next comes up. So thank you for joining us, and let's keep the conversation on Twitter and everywhere else. Have a great rest of your week, everybody.